The evidence against Clara Kowalski's survival kept arriving one piece at a time, a loan called due. A brick through the bakery window. An insurance inspection designed to shut her down. And 12 hours of blank footage from the camera above her back door. The police dismissed it. Clara said nothing. Instead, she logged every threat, slept beside the ovens, and kept her mother's rolling pin within reach. Gabriel Romano knew one fact no one else did. Her debt had already been paid in full by a company he controlled. So when Milo called after midnight, Gabriel did not send his men. He went himself. Inside Sweetwater, Clara was circling an 800-pound work table while Duke Halloran stood beside a gas can, bragging that he had disabled the camera in 4 minutes. Clara's phone was recording every word. Then Duke named the man who hired him, and Gabriel stepped through the front door with one warning. This was the last business Duke would ever do in the city. Clara Kowalski had run Sweetwater Bakery for 6 years. And in all that time, the man everyone in the neighborhood just called Gabriel had never once told her his last name. He came in every morning at 6:15, ordered the same cheese Danish and the same black coffee, sat at the corner table by the window with a folded newspaper he rarely read, and asked her, without fail, how the shop was doing, in a voice that made the question sound like he actually wanted the real answer. Clara had never pressed him on what he did for a living, mostly because Philadelphia was full of quiet men who didn't like being asked, and partly because 6 years of running her mother's bakery alone had taught her that some regulars were worth more for their steadiness than their biographies. She knew he tipped generously without making a show of it, that he always left before the morning rush got loud, that he'd once fixed the shop's stubborn front door hinge himself rather than mention it needed fixing, and that her nephew Milo, 17 and hopeless at chess, had somehow learned 3 real openings from a man who claimed he'd only ever played casually. You're better than casual, Milo had told him once, setting up the board on a slow Tuesday afternoon, and Gabriel had only shrugged. The small, private shrug of a man who'd learned a long time ago not to advertise what he was good at. Clara had built her whole adult life around Sweetwater without ever quite meaning to, taking over the register at 16 when her mother's arthritis first flared badly enough to need help, learning the ovens by feel rather than by any recipe book. And by the time she was old enough to imagine a different life for herself, the bakery had already become the only life that felt entirely hers. She had dated occasionally over the years, men who found her funny for exactly as long as it took them to decide her size, made her a project rather than a person. And she had stopped, somewhere around 30, expecting anyone new to be different, filing that particular disappointment away with the same brisk efficiency she used for a burnt batch of croissants. Gabriel's steadiness had crept up on her slowly, unnoticed, until she found herself listening for the bell above the door every morning around 6:15, without quite admitting to herself why. There had been a morning, early that winter, when Clara's hands had been shaking too badly from exhaustion to properly frost a wedding order due in an hour, and Gabriel, without being asked, had simply rolled up his sleeves, washed his hands at her sink, and held the piping bag steady while she guided his grip, the two of them finishing 3 dozen rosettes in near silence before he went back to his corner table, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. There had been another morning, in early spring, when he'd shown up not at 6:15 but at 5, catching her crying quietly over a delivery of spoiled butter she couldn't afford to replace. And he'd said nothing about the tears, only driven to a restaurant supply store the moment it opened and come back with exactly what she needed, refusing to let her pay him back and changing the subject so firmly that arguing felt like more trouble than it was worth. She had stopped, sometime around the second of those mornings, pretending to herself that whatever she felt for the quiet man in the corner was only gratitude. They talked, over the months, about small things, mostly. The kind of small things that added up to knowing someone without either of them noticing it happening. He liked jazz records more than he liked admitting it. She'd wanted to be a marine biologist at 9 years old before deciding she'd rather feed people than study fish. He'd never learned to swim properly and had no intention of starting now. She still kept her mother's handwritten recipe cards in a tin box that smelled faintly of vanilla and cinnamon no matter how many times she washed it. You never ask me anything real, she told him once, half teasing, refilling his coffee without being asked. I ask you plenty of real things, he said. Whether the ovens are holding up, whether Milo's chest is improving, whether you've eaten anything today besides other people's discarded pastries. Those aren't secrets, she said. They're the things that actually matter, he said, which is different from secrets, and more useful besides. She hadn't argued the point, mostly because some part of her had already decided she agreed with him. There had been a slower afternoon. Once, when Milo had been at a friend's house and the shop had emptied out early, and Gabriel had lingered past his usual 6:40 departure, watching Clara pipe a wedding cake's borders with the particular, unhurried focus she reserved for work she was actually proud of. You never watch anyone do that, she said, without looking up. I've never wanted to before, he said, and when she glanced up at him, surprised, he only shrugged. The same small, private shrug Milo had noticed on his first afternoon in the shop, and went back to his coffee before either of them had to decide what to do with the moment. He told her about Sal once, in pieces, over the better part of a month. Never quite the whole story at once, but always a little more than the last time. I had a friend, he started, one gray Tuesday, who ran a hardware store. Lost it to a bad deal a long time ago. I was too young to do anything about it. What happened to him? Clara asked. He's fine now. Retired. Ornery as ever, Gabriel said. I still think about the store more than I probably should, considering it wasn't mine to lose. Sounds like it was yours to lose a little, Clara said, gently. If you cared that much. He hadn't answered that directly, only turned his coffee cup a half turn on its saucer, and Clara had let the silence sit rather than push further, sensing, correctly, that she'd already gotten closer to something real than he was used to letting anyone get. Sweetwater Bakery had belonged to Clara's mother first, a narrow storefront with a chipped porcelain mixing bowl on the counter that had been there since before Clara was born. And Clara had inherited both the ovens and the debt 3 years after her mother's funeral. A fact she'd managed quietly and without complaint until the ovens themselves began failing one by one the winter before last. The loan she'd taken to replace them had seemed reasonable at the time. Arranged through a business consultant, a rival shop owner had recommended. The kind of paperwork that read fine in the moment and turned out, 18 months later, to contain a clause allowing the lender to call the balance due in full with 30 days' notice, under conditions Clara had never fully understood until the notice actually arrived. She hadn't told anyone about the notice yet. Not Milo. Not her few remaining friends from the old neighborhood. And certainly not the quiet man with the cheese Danish, though she'd come dangerously close to it more than once. Something about the steadiness of his attention, making her want to hand over burdens she'd otherwise have carried alone. The invitation to the Whitcomb Charity Gala had arrived the same week as the notice, addressed to the proprietors of our beloved neighborhood businesses, a phrase that had made Clara laugh out loud in her empty kitchen at 5 a.m. Bitter and short. They want us there so their photographers have something quaint to point at, she told Milo, who was folding the invitation into a paper airplane before she stopped him. You should still go, Milo said. Free food. And maybe somebody buys a dozen cupcakes out of guilt. Her friend Dot, who ran the flower shop 2 doors down and had loaned her the emerald dress in the first place, had zipped Clara into it that evening, with the particular briskness of a woman who'd heard every excuse Clara had for not going and had run out of patience with all of them. You are going to walk in there, hand out your lemon bars, and let every one of those people wonder why they never bothered coming to Delancey Street themselves, Dot said, fixing a stray curl at Clara's temple. You don't owe that room a single ounce of shrinking. I don't feel like I'm going to a party, Clara admitted. I feel like I'm going to be looked at. Then let them look, Dot said. You look like the best thing that's happened to that dress in 2 years. She went. In the end, in the borrowed emerald green dress, a strand of her mother's pearls at her throat, feeling entirely out of place among women whose dresses probably cost more than Sweetwater's monthly rent. Dot's pep talk carrying her exactly as far as the ballroom doors and no farther. The gala itself was held in a hotel ballroom 2 blocks from the bakery. All crystalline white tablecloths. Small business owners arranged near a long dessert table, like a display of local color for the wealthier guests to admire on their way to the bar. And Clara had barely set down her tray of lemon bars when Vanessa Ashcroft found her. Vanessa was the kind of woman who'd built an entire personality out of other people's discomfort. Blonde and precise. Married to City Councilman Preston Ashcroft. And she looked at Clara's tray. And then at Clara. With the particular, assessing cruelty of someone who'd never once had to worry what a room thought of her body. Sweetwater. Vanessa read off the little card in front of the lemon bars, in a voice pitched to Carrie. Is that the little shop on Delancey that's always got day-old bread in the window? I have to say, I'm surprised they let you cater tonight instead of just... Well, she gestured. Vaguely. At Clara's dress. At Clara herself, sampling the goods a bit too enthusiastically yourself. A ripple of laughter went through the small cluster of guests nearby. The easy, cruel laughter of people who decided in advance that Clara wasn't a person worth defending. And Clara felt her face go hot in the particular way it always did. The old, a familiar flinch she'd spent years training herself not to show. Another woman nearby. Older. In pearls that looked considerably more expensive than Clara's borrowed strand. Laughed loudest of all and added, unprompted, I do hope the lemon bars taste better than the shop looks from the street. Which drew a fresh wave of polite, ugly laughter from the small circle gathered near the dessert table. A photographer from the local paper, drawn by the noise, lifted his camera toward the scene before a gala organizer steered him firmly away, murmuring something about keeping the evening's coverage on brand, which told Clara everything she needed to know about which version of tonight's story anyone intended to print. The bread's baked fresh every morning, Clara said, keeping her voice as level as she could manage. 6 years running. You're welcome to check the ovens yourself if you'd like proof. I'm sure, Vanessa said, already turning away, already bored. Though I imagine standing over an oven all day does explain quite a lot. Clara didn't see the man at the far end of the dessert table go still. Didn't notice him, set down his own drink, and watched the exchange, with an expression that had gone flat and dangerous, in a way none of his usual mornings at her counter had ever shown. Because she was too busy holding her own face together long enough to walk to the ladies' room before she let any of it show. It was Gabriel who found her there 20 minutes later. In the hotel hallway outside the gala. Still composed, but with her hands not quite steady, around a glass of water someone had pressed into them. I didn't expect to see you here, Clara said, surprised enough to forget. Briefly. To be embarrassed. I didn't expect to see that happen to you, Gabriel said. And something in his voice made her look at him properly for the first time in 6 years of morning coffee. The quiet, careful attention she'd always assumed was just good manners, suddenly looking a great deal more like something else entirely. It's fine, she said. The automatic response. The one she gave everyone. It isn't, he said. Simply, but I understand why you'd say it is. He didn't offer to fix it. Didn't promise vague revenge. Didn't do any of the things men in movies did in moments like this. And somehow that restraint made her trust him more than any promise would have. For what it's worth, he added. After a moment, the ovens have never once explained anything about you worth knowing. Just so you're aware, I disagree with the premise entirely. Not only the delivery. That's a strange thing to say to someone crying in a hotel hallway, Clara said, though it startled a real, unguarded laugh out of her despite everything. I've been told I have strange timing, Gabriel said. I'd rather have strange timing than say nothing at all. I should get back, she said. I still have 3 dozen lemon bars to hand out. Save me one, he said. And it was such a small, ordinary thing to say that she found herself smiling despite everything. All the way back into the ballroom, Dot heard about the whole exchange within a day. The neighborhood grapevine being what it was. and showed up at Sweetwater the next morning, before opening with a box of pastries from a rival bakery 3 blocks over. Set deliberately on Clara's counter. "I bought these on purpose," Dot announced. "So you'd have the pleasure of telling me yours are better." Out loud. To my face. "Until you believe it again yourself." "That's a very roundabout way of cheering me up," Clara said, laughing despite herself for the first time since the gala. "It's the only way that's ever worked on you." Dot said, "So I'm sticking with it." Gabriel Romano did not. In fact, spend his mornings at Sweetwater Bakery because he lacked anywhere better to be. He ran the largest and most careful criminal organization in the city, inherited from a father who'd taught him that the quietest men lasted longest. And he had spent the better part of 15 years building a reputation for restraint that made him, if anything, more frightening than the men who shouted. He had also spent those same 15 years carrying a particular regret he rarely let himself examine directly. One that had nothing to do with any woman, and everything to do with a hardware store 2 blocks from the house he'd grown up in. Sal Iannucci had run that hardware store for 30 years, before a development consortium bought up half the block through a series of predatory loans. Nobody in the neighborhood fully understood until it was too late. And Gabriel, 17 at the time, and already deep in his father's business, but not yet powerful enough to matter, had watched Sal lose everything he'd built without being able to do a single useful thing about it. He still remembered standing on the sidewalk the day the eviction crew came. 17 years old and furious in the particular, useless way only teenagers can be furious. Watching men in cheap suits carry Sal's inventory out onto the curb, while Sal himself stood by the door and said nothing at all. Because there had been nothing left to say by then. "Don't you dare look at me like that," Sal had told him afterward, sitting on an overturned paint bucket amid the wreckage of 30 years of work. "You didn't do this, and you're not going to fix it by hating yourself over it for the next 40 years. So cut that out right now." Gabriel had not, in fact, managed to cut it out. Not fully. Not even now. And the hardware store's old sign, faded and cracked, still hung in Sal's daughter's garage across the river. A detail Gabriel had never mentioned to anyone, because he wasn't entirely sure what he'd say about it if he started. He still visited Sal sometimes, now retired and living with his daughter across the river. And the old man never once brought up the hardware store, which somehow made Gabriel think about it more, not less. "You're doing that thing again," Sal had told him, the last time Gabriel visited, "where you get quiet and start looking at me like you're 40 years too late to something." "Maybe I am," Gabriel had admitted, "then stop being late to the next one," Sal had said, which was as close as Sal ever came to giving advice directly. And Gabriel had carried that sentence around for months without quite knowing what to do with it, until a debt collector's letter and a councilman's wife's cruelty gave him an obvious enough place to finally put it. It had taken his people less than a week to trace the note on Clara's bakery back through 3 shell companies to its actual owner, a real estate consortium quietly controlled by Preston Ashcroft, who had spent the last 2 years buying up small business debt across 3 neighborhood blocks under names that led nowhere obvious, planning to force a wave of foreclosures the moment the city rezoned the area for a luxury development. His firm had already secured contracts to build. Vanessa's cruelty at the gala hadn't been incidental. She had known exactly which bakery she was humiliating and exactly how close it stood to defaulting, because her husband kept a spreadsheet of every small business on the block and precisely how many weeks each one had left. And mocking Clara in public cost her nothing at all, since as far as the Ashcrofts were concerned, Sweetwater Bakery had already been decided. Gabriel bought Clara's note outright 3 days later. Quietly. Through a 4th shell company, his own people controlled, that led back to nothing traceable. Paying the full balance in cash, and instructing the loan servicer to simply mark the account current without ever telling Clara who had done it. "You're spending real capital protecting a bakery." His second. A careful, gray-templed man named Silas, who'd run numbers for Gabriel's father before Gabriel himself, observed. Not quite a question, while they reviewed the transfer together. "That's not usually how you spend real capital. Sal's hardware store cost me nothing but a bad conscience for 15 years, Gabriel said. This one's going to cost me an afternoon of paperwork instead. I'll take the trade. And if Ashcroft notices the note's gone and comes back at her a different way, then he'll be doing it to someone I've already decided to protect, Gabriel said, which is a different problem for him than the one he thinks he has. Silas didn't argue further, mostly because in 19 years of watching Gabriel Romano make decisions, he had learned that the quiet ones were almost always the ones Gabriel meant most. For what it's worth, Silas added, gathering the paperwork. Your father would have called this soft. My father would have been wrong about plenty of things, Gabriel said, and he was wrong about Sally Annucci first. So I'm not especially worried about his opinion on a bakery. Silas allowed himself the smallest smile, the kind he rarely showed anyone, and said nothing further on the matter, filing the transaction away with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything else Gabriel asked of him. It should have ended there. Preston Ashcroft did not become a city councilman by failing to notice when a piece on his board got quietly removed from play. And it took his own people less than 2 weeks to discover that Sweetwater's defaulted note had been paid off in full by an entity none of his usual channels could trace back to anyone useful. Someone's protecting the baker, he told Vanessa, over a dinner neither of them was particularly enjoying. That complicates the block. It's one shop, Vanessa said. Buy her out directly. Everyone has a price. Not everyone, Preston said, and something in the flatness of his voice suggested he'd already tried, and been quietly, thoroughly refused by a woman he could no longer intimidate through her own debt. The Ashcroft Development Consortium had spent 2 years quietly assembling the rest of the block. 3 other small business notes bought and called due in careful sequence. A laundromat and a shoe repair shop already gone. A hardware store 2 doors down from Sweetwater negotiating its own exit even now. And Sweetwater's stubborn, unexplained solvency was the single loose thread threatening the whole rezoning timeline his firm had already promised investors. The rezoning vote is in 10 weeks, Preston said. I need that block clean before the council session. Not eventually clean. Find out who paid off her note and lean on them. Or lean on her directly, if that's simpler. You said yourself we couldn't trace the buyer, Vanessa said. Then we make the shop itself the pressure point instead of the paperwork, Preston said, and reached for his phone to call a number he'd used exactly twice before, both times for problems that had resolved themselves quietly and permanently. Preston Ashcroft's family had lost their own hardware business decades earlier, pushed out of a different neighborhood by a different consortium in a scheme not unlike the one he now ran himself. A fact he mentioned to almost no one and had never once connected, out loud, to the choices he'd made since. My father spent his whole life being the man things happened to, he told Vanessa once. The only time he'd ever explained himself directly to anyone. I decided a long time ago I'd rather be the man they happened because of. It was not, by his own accounting, a decision he regretted. Whatever it cost, the people standing in his way. He sent Duke Halloran to handle the bakery directly. A debt collector who'd worked the edges of Ashcroft's real estate schemes for 6 years and had a talent for making people reconsider their own stubbornness without ever quite crossing a line, the police could easily prove. Make her understand the offer isn't going to improve with time, Preston told him. I don't care how. Preston's spreadsheet, the one he kept on a laptop, he never let his own assistant touch, listed 11 businesses across the 3 affected blocks. Most already sold, folded, or quietly bought out through notes. His consortium controlled without ever attaching the Ashcroft name directly. And Sweetwater Bakery sat near the bottom of that list in a column marked simply unresolved. A word Preston found personally irritating every time he opened the file. Dot's Flower Shop was 2 lines below it, already deep into its own renegotiation. And Preston had every intention of finishing both before the rezoning vote, treating the entire block as a single problem to be solved, rather than 11 separate lives he'd never once bothered to picture individually. Vanessa, for her part, had grown up watching her own mother charm her way through rooms exactly like the Whitcomb ballroom, and had learned early that cruelty dressed as concern rarely cost a woman her invitations, only her conscience. And she'd long since decided that was a trade she could live with comfortably. She did not think of herself as the villain of anyone's story, mostly because she rarely thought about the people she stepped on long enough to consider their side of it at all. And Clara Kowalski, by the following morning, had already become a minor. Forgettable inconvenience rather than a person Vanessa spent any further time thinking about. Clara noticed the first sign of trouble 2 weeks after the gala. A brick through the bakery's side window with nothing attached. No note. No explanation. Only a scattering of glass across flour sacks she'd have to throw out. She called the police, who filed a report and told her these things happened sometimes on that block. And she called her insurance, who told her the deductible would eat most of what the claim was worth. And she did not call Gabriel, though she thought about it more than once during the long night she spent sweeping glass out of 50 pounds of ruined flour. The second sign came 4 days later. A notice slipped under the door in the middle of the night, informing her that her insurance policy had been quietly reviewed and flagged for a routine inspection. An inspection that would, coincidentally, require the shop to close for at least a week during its busiest season. Timed by someone who clearly understood exactly how thin Sweetwater's margins already were. Clara began keeping a log after that. Dates and times and photographs of every strange incident, tucked into a folder at the back of the same drawer where she'd once kept the loan notice. An old habit from years of tracking her mother's suppliers that had never once felt more useful than it did now. Milo noticed before Gabriel did, mostly because Milo was 17 and paid the particular anxious attention teenagers pay to adults they've quietly decided to worry about. "You've been checking the back door like 4 times a shift," Milo said. One afternoon. Not quite a question. "Habit," Clara said, which wasn't an answer. And Milo, wise enough not to push a woman who'd raised him through 2 difficult teenage years already, let it go without letting go of the worry itself. He brought it up again a week later, more directly, sliding the brick's police report across the counter, where she'd left it half hidden under a stack of invoices. "You should tell Gabriel," Milo said. "He fixed the hinge on the door in 10 minutes without being asked. I bet he knows people who fix worse things than hinges." "It's not his problem to fix," Clara said. "And I'm not in the business of handing my problems to a man over coffee. You're in the business of handing everybody else's problems to yourself instead," Milo said, which honestly seems worse. And Clara, caught without a good answer, changed the subject to the morning's bread order instead of arguing a point she suspected he was at least partly right about. She mentioned none of it to Gabriel directly, though she found herself, over their morning coffee, watching his face more closely than she used to, aware now of a stillness in him that felt less like calm and more like the surface of very deep water. "You've seemed tired," he said, one morning, setting down his coffee without drinking it. "Business," she said, which wasn't a lie. "Exactly. If it's more than business," he said, "you can tell me. I might be more useful than I look." "You look plenty useful," she said, deflecting with something close to a joke. And he let her, though something in his jaw tightened in a way she didn't understand yet. Duke Halloran, watching the bakery from a parked car across the street more mornings than Clara ever noticed, had already worked out that whoever had bought her note clearly had eyes on the shop, which meant a quieter approach than a second brick was probably warranted. He disabled the cheap security camera above Sweetwater's back door himself, 3 nights before he finally went in. A small, careful piece of work that took him less than 4 minutes and would have gone entirely unnoticed if Clara hadn't happened to check the camera's app on her phone out of habit the following morning and found 12 hours of blank footage where the feed should have been. She said nothing to the police, who had already made clear how much attention a broken window and a dead camera were likely to receive, and instead spent the next 2 nights sleeping on a cot in the bakery's back office, her mother's old rolling pin within reach, her phone charged and recording folder cleared for space, because 11 years of running a business on thin margins had taught her that some threats you handled yourself until somebody gave you a better option. Duke came on the 3rd night, a little after midnight, letting himself in through the same back door whose camera he'd already disabled. Carrying a gas can, he had every intention of leaving somewhere that would look To any fire inspector. Like faulty equipment rather than arson. Clara heard the door before she saw him, and had her phone recording and tucked into her apron pocket. Screen dark. Before he'd made it 3 steps into the kitchen. You're supposed to be asleep at home, Duke said, unbothered. The casual confidence of a man who'd done this kind of work often enough to stop expecting resistance. This is my home, Clara said, which wasn't strictly true, but felt true enough in the moment to say with a steady voice. 6 years of it. Won't be much longer, Duke said, setting the gas can down near the ovens. Close enough that its purpose didn't need explaining. Mr. Ashcroft's patience is a finite resource, and you've used most of it up. Might be smarter to walk out that door right now and let this happen without you standing in the middle of it. You work for Preston Ashcroft, Clara said. Not quite a question, keeping her voice level while her thumb found the record button through the fabric of her apron. I work for whoever pays on time, Duke said, which today happens to be him. Nothing personal in it. You disabled my camera 3 nights ago, Clara said, buying time. Keeping him talking the way she'd once read that people did in exactly this kind of situation, though she'd never expected to actually need the advice. That's not the work of someone who thinks this is simple. Careful work isn't the same as complicated work, Duke said, almost pleasant about it. The professional pride of a man who took genuine satisfaction in doing an ugly job cleanly. 4 minutes with a screwdriver. In and out. Nobody the wiser until this morning. I'm good at what I do. That's usually the whole problem for people like you. Setting a woman's family bakery on fire feels fairly personal from where I'm standing. Clara said, You're not going to be standing anywhere in about 10 minutes. Duke said, losing patience now, reaching for the gas can again. And it was that motion, that small shift of attention away from her, that gave Clara the 2 seconds she needed to do the only useful thing left available to her: scream, as loudly as her lungs allowed, directly toward the front of the shop and the street beyond it. Because whatever else was true about midnight on Delancey Street, somebody out there was always awake enough to hear a bakery in trouble. Duke lunged to silence her, and it was clumsy, more instinct than plan, and it gave her enough time to duck behind the heavy work table, putting 800 pounds of scarred oak between them. Her mother's rolling pin now in her free hand, less as a weapon than as something solid to hold on to while she kept the phone's camera aimed steady from her apron pocket. You really don't want to make this harder than it needs to be, Duke said, circling the table, and Clara circled with him, buying seconds the only way she had left. Neither do you, she said, keeping her voice as level as 6 years of standing over hot ovens had taught her a voice could stay. You disable one camera and think that's the whole job done. My mother ran this place for 30 years before me. There isn't a corner of this kitchen I don't know, blind. And there isn't a corner of it you know at all. Sentiment's not going to put that fire out once it starts, Duke said, though something in his voice had shifted. The first real crack in his professional calm. I'm not appealing to your sentiment, Clara said, evenly, still circling. I'm just talking. Because talking is the only thing keeping you on that side of the table instead of this one. And it was. In fact, precisely then, mid-sentence, that the front bell above Sweetwater's door rang for the first time in the shop's 6-year history at nearly 1 a.m. Gabriel had been 3 streets away when Milo, unable to sleep and checking the bakery's camera feed out of an anxious teenager's habit, had called him instead of the police, because some instinct in a 17-year-old boy had understood, without being told directly, that whatever was happening at Sweetwater might need a different kind of help than the police usually offered on that block. Duke did not get the chance to reach for anything more than the gas can before Gabriel had him against the wall. And whatever restraint Gabriel had spent 15 years cultivating in every other room of his life was nowhere present in that kitchen. Ashcroft sent you, Gabriel said. And it wasn't a question either. Business, Duke managed, still trying for the same casual tone that had worked on Clara, and finding it considerably harder to maintain with his collar in Gabriel Romano's fist. This is the last business you'll ever do in this city, Gabriel said, and something in the flat certainty of it made even Duke, a man who'd built a career on not scaring easily. "Go quiet. You disabled her camera," Gabriel added. And it wasn't a question at all this time. Only a fact he intended Duke to sit with. 4 minutes with a screwdriver. I heard that part from the hallway. Careful man like you should have checked whether she'd noticed the feed was dead before you came back a second time. Duke's eyes flicked. Just once. Toward Clara's apron pocket. And the small, sick understanding that crossed his face confirmed everything. The recording would later prove in far greater detail than his expression alone ever could. "Everybody in this city knows my name by reputation," Gabriel said. "You're about to learn it a great deal more personally." It was nearly 3 a.m. by the time the shop had been secured. Duke handed over to 2 of Gabriel's men with instructions Clara didn't ask to hear in detail, and the gas can remove to wherever such things disappeared to in Gabriel's world. Clara sat on an overturned flour sack, her mother's rolling pin still in one hand, watching Gabriel check every lock and window with the same methodical care he usually reserved for his morning newspaper. "You bought my loan," she said. "Not a question. The piece is finally settling into place. That's why the account showed current. That's why he sent someone. I should have told you," Gabriel said, sitting down across from her, close enough that their knees nearly touched. "I told myself I was protecting you by not explaining it. That was mostly me protecting myself from having this exact conversation." "Who are you?" she said, quietly. And it wasn't unkind. Only tired. Only honest. "Gabriel Romano," he said. "I run most of what happens in this city that people don't like to talk about at charity galas. I've been drinking your coffee for a year because it's the best part of most of my days. And because you never once asked me anything I didn't want to answer. And now I'm asking," she said. "Now you're asking." He agreed. "I'd understand if the answer changes things." Clara looked down at the recording still running quietly in her apron pocket. The whole of Duke's confession preserved in a file that would, over the following days, do more damage to Preston Ashcroft's career than anything Gabriel's organization could have arranged through more traditional means. "It doesn't change what you did tonight," she said. "Finally. Or the year before it. That's not the same as forgiving the rest," he said. "No," she agreed. "But it's a start. Come have dinner with me," he said. "Somewhere that isn't a hotel ballroom or a kitchen at 3 a.m. Somewhere ordinary." "I don't know what ordinary looks like with you," she admitted. "Neither do I. Honestly," he said. "I'd like to find out. If you're willing, ask me again once I've slept," Clara said. "And I'll probably say yes." "I can wait," Gabriel said. And there was something in the way he said it that made her believe, for the first time all night, that whatever came next might actually be worth trusting. Milo arrived 20 minutes later. Having run the 3 streets from home the moment Gabriel called back to say the situation was handled, and skidded to a stop in the kitchen doorway, taking in the shattered calm of the room. Clara upright and mostly unhurt. A stranger's gas can nowhere in sight. "You called him instead of the police," Clara said. "Not quite an accusation. I called the person who actually shows up," Milo said. Which was, Clara thought, probably the most honest assessment of the last year anyone in her life had managed. Preston Ashcroft did not go down easily, whatever the recording eventually cost him. The moment word reached him that Duke had been picked up and the bakery secured, he spent the remaining hours before dawn calling in 3 separate favors to get ahead of the story. Planting an early version with a friendly editor that painted Duke as a rogue contractor acting entirely without Ashcroft's knowledge. A version convincing enough that it very nearly worked before the recording itself surfaced in full 4 days later and made the earlier story collapse under its own contradictions. "He's fast," Silas admitted to Gabriel, reviewing the planted article with something close to professional respect. "Wrong, but fast. Fast doesn't help him once the actual recording's out," Gabriel said. "It just means he spends 4 extra days looking guilty of the cover-up on top of everything else." The recording reached a city reporter within the week. forwarded from an account that traced back to nobody. And Preston Ashcroft's carefully built development consortium collapsed under the weight of a debt collector's own recorded confession faster than any of his lawyers could manage the damage. Vanessa Ashcroft was seen, briefly, at one final charity function before quietly relocating to a city where nobody yet knew her name. And the block around Sweetwater Bakery went, within a year, from a neighborhood of predatory notes and shell companies to one where 3 other small business owners finally had their own debts renegotiated by lenders, suddenly far more interested in following the law to the letter. Preston Ashcroft resigned from the city council 11 days after the recording surfaced, standing at a podium in a suit that no longer fit the confidence he'd worn it with for a decade. Reading a statement about stepping back to spend time with family that fooled absolutely nobody in a room full of reporters who'd already seen the transcript. He did not mention Duke Halloran by name, did not mention Sweetwater Bakery, and did not, notably, mention Clara Kowalski at all. A small, telling omission that the local paper's follow-up piece made a point of noting in its very first paragraph. Dot cut that article out and taped it to Sweetwater's front window for a full month, until Clara finally asked her, gently, to take it down. I don't need to keep looking at his face to know we won. Clara said, fair enough. Dot said, and replaced it instead with a hand-lettered sign advertising a new seasonal muffin, which felt, to both of them, like a considerably better use of the window. The other business owners on the block took the news of Ashcroft's resignation with a mixture of relief and disbelief that took most of a week to settle into anything resembling normalcy. And the owner of the hardware store 2 doors down, who'd been a single signature away from losing everything, showed up at Sweetwater the following morning with a bouquet from Dot's shop and no real explanation beyond, I heard you had something to do with it, which Clara neither confirmed nor denied, mostly because she genuinely wasn't sure how much credit was hers to take. You did plenty, Gabriel told her later. When she mentioned it, the recording was yours. I just made sure the right person heard it. That's a very generous way of describing nearly getting me killed, Clara said, though there wasn't much heat left in it by then. I'm aware, he said. I think about that part more than you'd probably like to know. Their first real dinner happened 9 days later, at a small Italian place 2 neighborhoods over that Gabriel promised. Correctly, nobody from the Whitcomb crowd would ever set foot in, and Clara spent most of the meal waiting for the conversation to turn strange or careful and found, instead, that it mostly stayed exactly as ordinary as he'd promised it would be. You're better at ordinary than I expected, she told him. Over the last of a shared tiramisu, I've had a year of practice, he said. 6:15 every morning. Same Danish. Turns out ordinary just takes patience. Same as anything else worth having. That's a very tidy way of putting it. I run a business built on patience, he said. I'm allowed one tidy metaphor a year. Clara reopened the bakery 2 days after the break-in, refusing every offer to close permanently for repairs. Because 6 years of running the place had taught her that a shop that stopped baking stopped being a shop at all. The other small business owners on the block, freed from Ashcroft's quiet pressure for the first time in 2 years, began meeting monthly at Sweetwater's corner table to compare notes on suppliers and leases. An informal little coalition Clara had never intended to start, and now couldn't imagine the block without. Milo got his chess rematch the following week, and lost again, though he swore, loudly and often, that Gabriel had been cheating the entire year without anyone noticing. I've genuinely never cheated at chess in my life, Gabriel told him. Over a cheese Danish he no longer bothered pretending was his first visit of the week. Sure, Milo said, unconvinced. Resetting the board for a rematch, he was equally certain to lose. Gabriel visited Sal Iannucci again that spring, and told him, for the first time, the whole story of a bakery on Delancey Street and a debt he'd bought back before it could ruin anyone else. Took you long enough? Sal said, which was, from Sal, something close to pride, and then added, because Sal never let a sentimental moment go entirely unpunctured. Bring me one of her lemon bars next time. See if the councilman's wife had a point. The lemon bars, it turned out, were excellent. A fact Sal repeated to his daughter often enough that Clara started setting a box aside for him without being asked. Sal's daughter, for her part, began sending photographs of the old hardware store sign back to Clara occasionally, propped now in a place of honor on her own front porch instead of gathering dust in a garage. A small, quiet piece of restitution that nobody had explicitly arranged, but that everyone involved seemed glad had happened anyway. Sal himself started coming by Sweetwater in person every few weeks, ostensibly for the lemon bars and, more honestly, to keep an eye on the two of them, the way an old man reserves the right to keep an eye on people he's decided are his to worry about now. "Don't make me regret vouching for you," he told Gabriel once, entirely straight-faced, in front of a mortified Clara and a delighted Milo. "I've never once given you reason to regret anything," Gabriel said. "You gave me 40 years of reasons," Sal said. "But who's counting?" And went back to his lemon bar before anyone could argue the point further. 6 months on, Gabriel still came in at 6:15 most mornings, though he no longer pretended it was only for the coffee, and he'd started leaving his newspaper folded shut more often than not, choosing instead to talk with Clara through the early rush, the way he'd apparently wanted to all along. "You could just move the corner table into the back office," Milo suggested once, only half joking. "Save everyone the pretense." The pretense was never the point, Gabriel told him. The coffee was always the point. The rest just happened to come with it, which Milo declared, loudly, to be the single sappiest thing he'd ever heard a grown man say before a full breakfast rush. Dot made him repeat the line twice more that week to different regulars, purely so she could watch Clara's face turn the exact same shade of pink each time. A small, ongoing joke the whole shop seemed to have quietly agreed never to let her live down. "I regret ever saying it in front of witnesses," Gabrielle told Clara once, resigned to his fate. "You should have thought of that before you said something sappy in a bakery full of gossips," Clara said, entirely without sympathy, and kissed him anyway, right there behind the counter, in full view of anyone who happened to be looking. Clara kept her mother's rolling pin on the counter after that, no longer hidden in a drawer for emergencies, and told the story behind it to anyone who asked, leaving out only the parts that were still hers and Gabriel's to keep, tucked away as quietly and carefully as a debt paid in full before anyone else ever knew to look for it. The little coalition of business owners that had started meeting at Sweetwater's corner table eventually gave itself a name, half joking and half serious, calling themselves the Delancey Street Irregulars after Milo suggested it during a meeting that had otherwise devolved into an argument about flour suppliers. And the name stuck for no better reason than that everyone liked saying it out loud. Dot framed the newspaper clipping about Ashcroft's resignation after all. In the end, not in the front window where Clara had asked her to take it down, but in the back office, where only the two of them and Milo ever saw it. A small private reminder rather than a public trophy. "Some things you keep for yourself," Dot said, hanging it slightly crooked on purpose. "Not for the customers." And Clara found she didn't mind that version nearly as much. Gabriel's corner table stayed exactly where it had always been, though the newspaper he used to hide behind eventually disappeared from the routine entirely. And Milo liked to point out, whenever the topic came up, that a Mafia boss, who no longer bothered pretending to read the news over his coffee, had probably given up on more than one kind of armor at once.